Hello and welcome to my paper on the Other Voices Festival and associated media productions. Thanks very much for watching the video. So this is based on research from my chapter in the forthcoming Made in Ireland Studies in Popular Music, which is co-edited by Anya Manyowing and Lonan O'Brien. That's a picture of me pre-COVID haircut. So, Other Voices is a niche yet highly influential broadcast TV series and music festival that has been based and recorded in the town of Dingle, West Kerry since the early 2000s. Over the past 2 decades, the festival has expanded its scope and reach and has travelled to other locations in Ireland and abroad. Beginning as a live music gathering in the intimate environments of the town's St. James Church in 2001, Other Voices, Songs from a Room, as it was originally called, was initiated by folk musician Philip King, formerly executive producer for the BBC RTE series Bringing It All Back Home and also River of Sound, both in the 1990s. The idea for Other Voices, or henceforth OV, emerged from interviews King conducted with Indian folk musicians on his long-running South Wind Blows show on RTE Radio 1. South Wind Blows was also the name later adopted by the media company who produced OV and its associated events, recordings and broadcasts. The first OV event in 2001 represented a collaboration with Glenn Hansard and the Frames, who happened to be recording an album in Dingle at that time. Looking back at the festival's origins 1 decade later, King made the following observations over 2 separate interviews. What King alluded to in these interviews was the emergence of a wave of post-national contemporary singer-songwriters and other acoustic acts at the turn of the 21st century. Collectively, they appeared to represent what he described as a coherent voice, continuous with and yet alternative to the previously dominant genres of rock and political folk. After the second OV festival in 2002, King proceeded to produce an annual Other Voices TV series for RTE television. This was followed by the release of Other Voices CDs in 2003 and in 2004 under the home-produced Dara label. The networking and media opportunities that OV afforded to emerging domestic musicians in its early years were significant. And indeed, this is a point acknowledged by many of those who went on to develop highly successful careers, including Glenn Hansard, The Frames, Damien Rice, Lisa Hannigan, and in recent years, Conor O'Brien, The Villagers, and Hosier. However, as discussed below, relationships with some domestic musicians became fraught by the time of the 2018 festival. From its inception, OV was informed by an anti-hegemonic stance through seeking to bring an emerging generation of other voices to Irish audiences. However, by 2003, its programming policy began to draw some negative critical response for what was perceived to be its own orthodoxy. In the assessment of rock journalist Tony Clayton-Lee, the festival had at that time reached the stage when only so many people could stomach only so many sensitive Irish singer-songwriters. Gradually increasing its funding from RTE and from the state's Department of Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, OV expanded in 2004 to include international acts as well as a more eclectic lineup of domestic artists. The former included Josh Ritter, Rufus Wainwright, Ryan Adams, Amy Winehouse, The National, and Florence and the Machine. A consistent theme that can be interpreted in the testimonials of these and other international artists to feature in OV over the years is a feeling of intimacy within a small town location on a remote Irish peninsula, combined with the festival's pared down and mainly acoustic aesthetic. In these respects, it seems fair to conclude that OV affords a special sense of belonging to its visiting musicians as much as it does to the festival's fans and local residents. However, the cliché of leading international artists rubbing shoulders with local fishermen in Dingle's pubs tends to be overplayed in Irish music journalism, with little or no analysis to date of the series or festival's impact and sustainability from the perspective of local communities. Furthermore, much of the commentary concerning OV's uniqueness on the part of its organisers, as well as by Irish media commentators, fails to consider how numerous national and international music festivals from the 1960s to date have similarly been imagined in terms of the special aura and sense of community that they generate. As Chris Connell and John Gibson observe in their study of music festivals in rural Australia, quote, most festivals create a time and space of celebration, a site of convergence separate from everyday routines, experiences, and meanings, ephemeral communities in place and time, end quote. Since its establishment, OV has been mediated and mediatized. While this puts it in line with established patterns in international rock festivals, from Woodstock in 1916 to the annual Glastonbury Festival in Somerset, England, OV uniquely conceives itself as a series of TV recordings around which a major music and arts festival has incrementally grown. Mediatized representations of OV include the early CD releases and the annual TV series, and more recently, social media sites and Spotify lists. Since 2009, the festival has been live streamed in the town's many pubs. This was brought about partly as a result of the limited capacity of St. James's Church. Arguably, OV's practice of live streaming is also in keeping with an enterprise that emerged around the same time as popular music's digital turn, and that adroitly maintains its aesthetic of otherness by inviting viewers into the intimacy of a limited capacity space or room. A more substantial media production by OV is the film Amy Winehouse, The Day She Came to Dingle, first broadcast for the BBC documentary series Arena in 2012. This is a sophisticated one-hour documentary featuring the renowned singer's acoustic session at the 2006 festival, intercut with testimonial interviews and shots of the locality. As its title suggests, the film's narrative resonates with that of OV's projection of uniqueness and peripherality. And in that montage, you can see the film producer, Phil King, who's kind of talking about this relationship between Amy Winehouse and this remote place. The producers of OV can be credited with correctly reading the shifting relationship between live events and popular music industries in the early 21st century. The festival expanded in 2007 with the introduction of the IMRO Other Room, a series of closed recorded gigs sponsored by the Irish music rights organisation, IMRO, and held annually at An Chonur, an alternative publication in Dingle. This was a fringe event with main stage televised acts. This was and remains a platform for what are deemed to be emerging, cutting-edge artists and bands from across Ireland. The IMRO Other Room marks out Dingle as a showcase platform for young Irish musicians and further succeeds, albeit temporarily, in moving key personnel from domestic music industries who are mostly centred in Dublin to a rural location. Excuse me. Other innovations based at the festival include the OV Music Trail, established in 2011, that programs free live concerts in several venues across the town. There's also the Talking Shop series Banter, and the more recent establishment of a conference or forum titled Ireland's Edge. Banter is curated by journalist Jim Carroll and famously takes place in Foxy John's, a pub cum hardware store in Dingle. Meanwhile, Ireland's Edge is curated by Nuala O'Connor, who was also centrally involved in the 1991 TV series and book Bringing It All Back Home. And it is described as, quote, a multidisciplinary creative event series that explores collaborations and collisions between the arts, technology, innovation, storytelling, and human experience, end quote. The idea of representing a country's edge is continuous with the festival's dual claims of representing narratives that are at once Irish and other. OV's imagery relating to an Irish periphery was further consolidated when it aligned its brand with that of the Wild Atlantic Way tourism trail launched by Fáilte Ireland Irish Tourism in 2014. In that same year, OV hosted its own stage at Electric Picnic, a major music festival that takes place outside the Midlands village of Stradbally, County Laois. OV's continued annual participation in Electric Picnic is indicative of how, on the one hand, it occupies a niche position within the mainstream of the festival circuit, and on the other hand, how it works to build national and international networks. The series travelled to Londonderry several times since 2012 and was also staged in Belfast in 2017. The town of Ballina in County Mayo became a new destination in 2018 and was marketed as part of a greater OV trail stretching from Kerry to Derry or back as part of the Wild Atlantic Way. Additionally, OV has toured abroad to the international locations New York, London, Austin, and Berlin. These showcase events receive funding from Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and/or from the cultural agency Creative Ireland. They undoubtedly presented valuable showcase opportunities for the range of artists selected to be represented abroad. Here it might be worth stating that by the early 2010s, OV had become quite eclectic in terms of its inclusion of domestic genres, from contemporary urban folk to hip-hop to pop electronica. Related to this, the IMRO Other Room selections would increasingly also feature acts that reflected the emergence of a significantly more multicultural population, along with more socially diverse acts, including artists and bands that associated themselves with LGBT issues and sensibilities. Other voices as cultural entrepreneurship. If cultural entrepreneurship for music can be said to have begun with demarcations of high culture in the 19th century, recent manifestations of cultural entrepreneurship have more typically constructed narratives around alternative articulations of cultural capital. We can go from Bourdieu to Sarah Thornton. Given their involvement in so many mediatized productions of Irish folk, traditional and popular music over 3 decades, Philip King, Nuala O'Connor, and their colleagues at Southwind Blow's production team, previously Hummingbird Productions, can be considered as modern-day cultural entrepreneurs with significant influence on media and arts policy in contemporary Ireland. The various productions that Hummingbird were involved with during the 1990s undoubtedly gave voice to and documented histories and modern developments in Irish folk and traditional music. Arguably, these series were significant in advancing national and international recognition for hitherto neglected Irish music histories, including those of the Irish diaspora. However, insofar as they claim to be overarching narratives of the country's vernacular musics, collectively they failed to give voice to those involved in the bulk of domestic popular music production and consumption over this time. Since 2001, Other Voices and its associated media productions have justifiably attracted much media and industry acclaim, and there are few who would deny the range and quality of participating international and Irish musicians, as well as the high production standards that Southwind Blows brings to the many enterprises in which it is involved. And similar to the BBC's long-running Later with Jules Holland TV show, it could be argued that OV successfully transmits and translates the aura of liveness through its range of mediatized productions. Ironically, OV's programming and media dominance in Ireland places its production and distribution outlets at the core of the very hegemony against which it sets out to identify itself as other. Indeed, such is the influence of OV that over the past decade, its model has been adapted by the organisers of several gig series, festivals, and other events across Ireland. The Irish voices that OV represents might more appropriately be considered as dominant others, insofar as they enjoy a disproportionate share of arts funding and media programming time, while at the same time assuming an anti-hegemonic and alternative aesthetic outlook. While some participants in this milieu consistently emerge as the unofficial voices of Ireland, for example, Glenn Hansard, Conor O'Brien, Lisa Hannigan, and contemporary traditional group The Gloaming, there are also those other voices that participate in the festival's Other Room. Sponsored by IMRO, this functions, as said before, to showcase emerging talent, and many commercially successful artists have acknowledged the career benefits of being successful for these OV IMRO gigs and recording sessions, and there's a shortlisting process each year. Furthermore, annual lineups for the IMRO Other Room have become increasingly eclectic in terms of the breadth of contemporary genres and the representation of different groups within society. However, This broader accommodation of music styles and celebration of other identities has not today transferred into the more symbolic national media events produced by Southwind Blows. For example, the production titled Kalura, or Celebration, which Southwind Blows organised as an event symbolically hosted by the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, during his historic official visit to the UK in 2014. And I include a consideration of this and similar events in the book chapter. The perceived benefits of participation in the Other Voices Festival were abruptly called to question when, in October 2018, musician Hilary Woods posted the following on Twitter. I'm very sorry to have to turn down the offer of playing The Other Room at Other Voices Live in Dingle this year, but it's just not financially or emotionally feasible or sound to do any kind of gig for free in exchange for exposure, no key to cover costs for TV Corps or otherwise. End quote. Woods's tweet sparked a debate that was far from one-sided. While many artists lauded her for breaking a silence regarding the precarious existence of many musicians and bands involved in OV and other industry showcase events, others, including those who previously benefited from OV exposure, for example, the trad folk duo The Vagabonds, were quick to defend the principles behind the festival's policy of covering only the travel and accommodation costs for selected other room participants. More surprising, perhaps, was the relative silence of music journalists and other regular media commentators on OV regarding the valid points raised by Woods. One exception to this was Irish Times journalist Una Mullally, who had attended and reported on many previous festivals. Writing shortly after the Twitter debate, Mullally, I should have said Una Mullally, sorry, acknowledged that OV's mission of promoting and nurturing new voices had been, quote, wrenched from its hickey, end quote, by Woods's revelations. But Mullally nonetheless went on to rehearse the production company's declared ethos as a self-evident justification for non-payment of artists' fees for other room participants. In the same article, Mullally accurately reported both the programme expansion and financial difficulties facing the 2018 festival, but without linking these strategies back to the issues raised around musicians' experiences. In some respects, it could be said that the real other voice to emerge from OV 2018 was Hilary Woods, in spite of the fact that she declined an invitation to participate. So I'm coming to the conclusion, subtitled Otherness and Hiddenness. In the main, contemporary mediatized productions of Irish popular music strategically negotiate more subtle articulations of post-colonial identities than in previous decades. Thus, while ideas of an Irish internal other are perhaps less explicitly invoked than at the turn of the 21st century, post-national appropriations of centre-periphery discourses conceal and yet promote what Nura Karaljainen coins, quote, the narrative of cozy otherness, end quote, in her analysis of media representations of contemporary female folk singers from England, Ireland, and Scotland. Remaining largely hidden in the ideological sense, these repositioning strategies lead to conceptions of alternative cultural capital that have in many respects become dominant in Irish media and cultural policies. Hiddenness, in the sense of not being seen or heard, may be attributed to and or perceived by those who do not necessarily subscribe to what have now become almost orthodox positions of otherness in media representations of Irish musical culture. Although commercially successful genres dominate airtime on Irish radio as elsewhere, the proportion of radio or TV programming for domestic popular music is minimal by comparison with other jurisdictions. This excludes an abundance of bands in more established rock and pop genres, as well as new acts in hip-hop, electronica, dance, soul, and R&B. In fact, the TV series From a Whisper to a Scream, which was broadcast back in 2000, represents the only substantial narrative addressing the mainstream of Irish popular music in any media production to date. And while a small group of internationally successful rock and pop musicians from Ireland, Van Morrison, U2, etc., have consistently been included as part of an imaginary National Hall of Fame for a plethora of productions, going back to Bringing It All Back Home in 1991, These have been woven into inward-looking narratives that privilege Irish folk and traditional music. Critically, over the past 2 decades, there have been no equivalent media productions that celebrate the ubiquity and diversity of internationally influenced music genres in domestic scenes. Overall, mediations of Irish folk and popular music can be said to reflect a nuanced post-colonial dialectic, vacillating between conceptions of centre and periphery. Both types of conceptions are closely tied to media constructions that in turn can be interpreted through the binaries of anti-hegemonic, hegemonic, a term and idea I borrow from Johannes Brusilla, and also post-national, national. A page on the website of the national broadcaster, RTE, advertising Philip King's long-running radio show, South Wind Blows, proudly asserts that the production, quote, comes from the edge of Europe, from the most westerly tip of the Dingle Peninsula, end quote. This imagery of a geographical periphery belies the dominant position that King and other cultural entrepreneurs occupy in media and cultural representations. While their various enterprises and narratives have done much to promote established as well as emerging music genres across the island, their media dominance has also acted to obscure much of the everyday, local, and popular. Thank you.